The black ship came down from the sky like a dark stone falling into water, and the desert dust rose up around it in great clouds that took a long time to settle back down to earth. And Jacob Morgan stood on his porch watching it all happen with a feeling in his chest that told him nothing good was coming from this. And he had lived 73 years on this land, and he knew trouble when he saw it. And this was trouble of a kind he had never seen before, but trouble all the same. The ship was not like the human ships that sometimes passed overhead on their way to the cities or the space stations that orbited Earth, and it was made of something that looked like black glass or maybe obsidian, and it gleamed in the late afternoon sun as it settled down in the valley just beyond his property line. And Jacob could feel the heat from its engines even from where he stood. And he thought about his son Daniel, who had left 5 years ago to join something called the Galactic Frontier Corps, and he wondered if Daniel knew that these kinds of ships were coming to Earth now. The door of the ship opened with a sound like air being sucked out of a room, and 6 figures came walking down the ramp, and they were tall, and Jacob had to squint to see them properly in the fading light. But he could tell they were not human, and they were not friendly either, and they walked like they owned everything they looked at. And Jacob had seen that kind of walk before in men who thought their money or their guns made them better than other people, and he had never liked it then, and he did not like it now. The creatures were nearly 8 feet tall, and their skin looked like it was covered in armor. But the armor seemed to be growing right out of their bodies like the shell of a beetle, and their faces were something out of a nightmare with too many parts that moved when they should not move, and eyes that caught the light and threw it back in colors that hurt to look at. And they carried weapons that Jacob did not recognize, but he knew a weapon when he saw one. Just like he knew trouble when it came walking across his land without asking permission. Jacob reached inside his door and pulled out his rifle, and it was old, and it used bullets instead of the plasma or laser things that most people use now. But it had belonged to his father and his grandfather before that, and it still worked just fine. And he checked to make sure it was loaded, and then he stepped off his porch and walked out to meet these creatures because they were coming toward his house, and they had already knocked down his fence like it was made of paper, and nobody knocked down his fence without answering for it. The creatures stopped when Jacob raised his rifle and pointed it at the one in front who seemed to be the leader. And Jacob called out in a voice that was steady, even though his heart was beating hard enough to hurt. And he said that was far enough. And he told them they were on private property, and they needed to turn around and go back to wherever they came from. The leader made a sound that might have been laughing, and Jacob's earpiece translated the words into English, and the creature said that Jacob was standing on land that belonged to the Krelvan Dominion now, and there was some law about salvage. That meant they could take any world that did not have enough soldiers to protect it, and Earth had sent all its soldiers away to other planets, and so this land was theirs now, and Jacob needed to leave or die. Jacob felt his jaw get tight, and he said this was his land and his family had worked it for 200 years, and he did not care what their laws said because his laws said this was his property and they needed to leave right now. And the creature leader spread its mouth parts in something that looked like a smile, but was not a smile at all. And it said then Jacob would die defending his land. The creatures moved fast, and Jacob barely had time to fire his rifle once, and the bullet hit the leader right in the chest. But it bounced off the armor like it was nothing, and then they were on him. And he swung the rifle like a club, and felt it connect with one creature's head. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong, and they grabbed him and lifted him up and slammed him against the porch column, and the wood cracked, and so did something inside Jacob's chest. The leader put its face close to Jacob's face and said humans were weak, and had no claws or armor or strength, and were soft things that should have stayed hiding in caves. And Jacob spat blood and said humans had survived worse than this, and the creature said Jacob would not survive today. What happened next was something Jacob would remember in pieces like a broken mirror, and the creatures beat him with their hands and their weapons, and they broke his bones one at a time, and they made sure he stayed awake through all of it, and they recorded everything with their devices, and Jacob heard them say they always recorded these things to prove they had followed their laws and taken the land properly. They tore down his house, and the walls that his great-grandfather had built with his own hands came down like they were made of cards, and they set fire to his fields, and the crops that he had planted in the spring burned and turned to black smoke that rose into the sky and could be seen for miles, and through it all Jacob lay in the dirt unable to move, and barely able to breathe, but still alive and still conscious and still watching. When they were done, the leader stood over Jacob and said Earth would learn that there was an order to the galaxy, and the strong took what they wanted, and the weak submitted, and that was how it had always been. and how it would always be. And then, the creatures walked back to their ship and left Jacob lying in the ruins of everything he had built and everything his family had built before him. Jacob stared up at the sky as the stars began to come out, and he thought about Daniel, and he hoped his son was safe wherever he was, and he hoped Daniel never had to see what had happened here. And he did not know that at that very moment, a message was being sent across the stars, and that message would reach Daniel within hours, and that everything was about to change in ways the Krelvin could never imagine. Daniel Morgan sat in the quiet room at the outpost on a planet called Kepler that was far from Earth and far from anything he had known growing up, and he was trying to clear his mind the way his teacher Nantan had showed him, and the room smelled like burning sage, which was something Nantan had taught him to use, and it reminded Daniel of home, even though home was so far away now. 5 years had passed since Daniel left Earth, and those 5 years had taught him things he wished he did not know. And the biggest thing he learned was that humans were not respected in the galaxy, and most alien species thought humans were weak and stupid and barely worth noticing, and they treated humans like animals or worse. And Daniel had seen things that made him angry in ways he could not put into words. But he had also met the Apache, and despite their name, they were not from Earth. And they came from a planet with a name that meant mountain against the sky, and they looked almost human. But their skin was dark red and could change color like a chameleon, and their eyes could see heat, and they were strong and fast. And they had been slaves to the Krelvin 300 years ago, and 50 years ago, they had fought a war so terrible that even the Krelvin had agreed to let them go free. Daniel had met Nantan after a fight in a bar where some Krelvin soldiers had been pushing humans around. And Daniel had fought back, even though there were 5 of them and only 1 of him, and he had lost the fight badly, but he had hurt 3 of them before they put him down, and Nantan had found him afterward bleeding in an alley, and Nantan had looked at him with eyes that seemed to understand something, and had asked why Daniel fought when he knew he would lose. Daniel had said someone had to fight, and someone had to show these aliens that humans were not going to just roll over. And Nantan had nodded slowly and said, Daniel fought like he had something to prove, and then Nantan had taken Daniel to meet the other Apache warriors, and that had been the beginning of everything. The Apache had taught Daniel how to fight properly and how to survive and how to think like a warrior, and in return Daniel had told them about Earth's history, and especially about the Apache people from Earth's past, and the alien Apache had been amazed because the 2 peoples had so much in common even though they were from different worlds and had never met. And they both valued the same things like honor and courage and never giving up no matter how bad things got. Now Daniel wore the marks of an Apache warrior, and he had scars from battles and tattoos that told his story, and he wore a red sash that meant he was a brother to the Apache people, and he was the first and only human to ever be accepted into their nation. And he was proud of that even though it had cost him blood and pain and nearly his life more than once. The communicator on his wrist made a sound, and Daniel looked down and saw it was marked as emergency, and it was from Earth, and it was about family, and his hand started shaking as he opened the message because he knew nothing good ever came from messages like that. The video played, and Daniel watched in silence as the Krelvin ship landed near his father's ranch, and he watched his father walk out with his old rifle, and he watched his father try to defend his home, and he watched the Krelvin beat his father and break him and destroy everything, and Daniel's hands clenched so hard his nails cut into his palms and drew blood. When the video ended, Daniel sat very still for a long time, and his face showed nothing, but inside him something was burning like a star, and it was cold and hot at the same time. And it was the kind of anger that does not shout or rage, but instead thinks and plans and waits for the right moment to strike. Daniel stood up and walked out of the meditation room and through the halls of the outpost until he found Nantan in the training area working with younger warriors. And when Nantan saw Daniel's face, he stopped immediately and sent the others away and asked what had happened. Daniel showed him the video, and Nantan watched it without speaking. And when it was done, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said the Krelvin had made a mistake. And Daniel said yes, they had made a very big mistake. And Nantan said they needed to call a council meeting right away. The council chamber was carved from rock inside a mountain, and it was where the Apache leaders met to make important decisions. And Daniel had never been allowed to attend before because he was still young in their eyes and new to their ways. But Nantan brought him anyway and stood beside him as they faced the war chiefs. Nantan explained what had happened and said the Krelvin had attacked Daniel's family and destroyed their home under some law about salvage. And Nantan said Daniel was calling for justice and asking for help, and the chamber went silent, because what Daniel was asking had never been done before. Chief Cochise was the leader of all Apache military forces, and he was old and covered in scars, and his eyes were hard like stone, and he said the Krelvin had hurt many peoples, and why should the Apache risk themselves for humans who were new and weak and unprepared for the galaxy? Daniel stepped forward, and his voice did not shake when he spoke, and he said he was not asking them to fight for humanity, but to honor brotherhood, and he had earned the right to ask for help because he had bled with Apache warriors and stood beside them in battle, and they had made him one of them. A female chief named Lozan, who commanded special forces, said Daniel spoke the truth, and he was one of them, and their code demanded they answer his call, and another chief said the code was written for Apache people, not for outsiders, but Nantan's voice cut through the argument like a knife. Nantan said Daniel was not an outsider, and he was Apache, and if they abandoned him now they were saying their brotherhood meant nothing, and they would be no better than the Krelvin who only honored power and convenience, and the chamber fell silent again because everyone knew he was right. Chief Cochise stood and walked over to Daniel and looked at him for a long time, and then asked why Daniel's father had stood against 6 Krelvin warriors when he knew he would lose, and Daniel said because it was his home and his land, and some things were worth dying for. Cochise smiled slightly and said yes, some things were worth dying for and some brothers were worth fighting for, and he turned to the other chiefs and called for a vote, and asked who would ride with Daniel to answer this wrong, and hands went up around the chamber, and not all of them, but more than half. Lozan stood and said she would take 400 warriors, and they would be volunteers only, and they would move fast and strike hard and leave a message the Krelvin would never forget. And Nantan gripped Daniel's shoulder and said 400 Apache warriors against a Krelvin garrison, and they would never see it coming, and Daniel felt something break inside him like a dam breaking, and all the emotion he had been holding back wanted to pour out. But he kept it inside because he was Apache now, and Apache warriors did not break down in front of others. The ships that carried them toward Earth were painted black and treated with special coatings that made them almost invisible to sensors, and they moved through space like shadows. And inside those ships, 400 Apache warriors prepared themselves for battle in silence, and Daniel sat among them feeling like he was in a dream or maybe a nightmare, and he could not quite believe this was real. Lozan moved through the ship, checking on her warriors and making sure everyone had what they needed, and when she came to Daniel, she sat beside him and asked if he was ready, and Daniel said he did not know, and she nodded, like that was a good answer, because warriors who thought they were ready for everything were usually the first to die. The journey took 3 days because they could not use the normal jump gates that connected the major systems, and those gates were monitored by Krelvin forces, and using them would have given away their approach, and instead they used old routes through space that took longer but were less watched, and the ships moved quietly through the dark. Daniel spent those 3 days training with the other warriors and checking his equipment over and over, and trying not to think about his father lying broken in the dirt, and every time he closed his eyes he saw the video again, and saw the Krelvin beating his father and destroying his home, and the anger in his chest grew colder and harder. Nantan found him on the second day sitting alone in a storage area, and Nantan sat down without being invited, and was quiet for a while before speaking, and he said Daniel needed to be careful, because anger was a weapon, but it was also a poison, and if Daniel let it control him he would make mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. Daniel said he was not angry, and Nantan laughed and said, lying to yourself was the fastest way to get killed, and Daniel was angry and had every right to be angry, but he needed to use that anger like a tool, and not let it use him. And Daniel was quiet for a moment and then asked how Nantan stayed calm when fighting the Krelvin who had enslaved his people for so long. Nantan said he stayed calm by remembering that every Krelvin he killed was one less Krelvin in the universe, and that was a good thing. But if he died, because he was too angry to think clearly, then he could not kill any more Krelvin, and that would be wasteful. And Daniel almost smiled at that because Nantan had a way of making complicated things sound simple. On the 3rd day they reached Earth, and the ships came in dark, dropping from orbit in the middle of the night over New Mexico, and the descent was rough because they were coming in fast and without clearance, and the ships shook and rattled, and some of the younger warriors looked nervous, but the veterans just checked their weapons one more time. The ships landed in the desert 5 miles from where the Krelvin had built their garrison, and the rear doors opened, and 400 Apache warriors poured out into the night, and they moved like water flowing downhill, spreading out, and disappearing into the darkness, and Daniel moved with them, his body remembering all the training he had received. They moved toward the garrison, but Daniel and Nantan split off with a small team and headed toward what was left of his father's ranch, and Daniel's heart was pounding hard as they got closer, and he was afraid of what they would find when they got there. The house was mostly gone, and what was left was just broken walls and burned wood, and the fields were black and dead, and Daniel felt something twist in his chest, but he pushed it down and focused on moving forward, and then he saw a light in what had been the living room. They approached carefully with weapons ready, and when they looked inside, they saw Jacob lying on a makeshift bed that someone had put together, and there was a woman from town sitting beside him with water and bandages. And when she saw the Apache warriors appear out of the darkness, she screamed and tried to run, but Nantan caught her gently and told her in English that they were friends and they were here to help. Daniel pushed past them and knelt beside his father, and Jacob's eyes were closed, and his face was swollen and purple with bruises, and his left arm was bent wrong, and his breathing was shallow and rough, and for a terrible moment Daniel thought they were too late. Then Jacob's eyes opened and he looked up at Daniel, and for a few seconds there was no recognition, and then something cleared in his eyes and he whispered Daniel's name like a question. Daniel said yes, it was him, and he was here now, and he had brought friends, and Jacob's eyes moved to where Nantan stood, and Jacob looked at this alien warrior with red skin and glowing eyes, and Jacob had seen many things in his life, but nothing quite like this. Jacob asked if they were Apache, and his voice was barely a whisper, and Nantan said yes, and Jacob asked how many, and Daniel said 400 warriors, and Jacob's good hand reached out and gripped Daniel's arm with surprising strength. Jacob said the Krelvin had recorded everything and said it was legal, and said nobody would care and nobody would come, and Daniel felt his jaw clench. And he said the Krelvin were wrong about everything, and they would learn that tonight. A quiet beep sounded in Daniel's ear, and Lozen's voice came through calm and professional, and she said all teams were in position around the garrison, and the enemy suspected nothing, and they were waiting for Daniel's command. Daniel looked at his father and saw all the pain and damage the Krelvin had done, and he saw the ruins of the home his family had built over generations, and he saw the burned fields and broken fences, and something inside him became very cold and very clear. Jacob seemed to know what Daniel was thinking, and he nodded once, giving permission for what was about to happen, and Daniel reached up to his communicator and said one word into it, and that word was execute. The woman from town was staring at all of them with wide eyes, and Nantan explained quietly that they were going to deal with the Krelvin garrison, and she should stay here with Jacob and keep him safe. And she nodded rapidly and said she would, and she looked terrified, but also hopeful, like maybe for the first time since the Krelvin came, she thought things might get better. Daniel stood and checked his weapon, and Nantan did the same, and the other warriors in their team spread out around the ruins of the house, creating a defensive perimeter, and Daniel looked one more time at his father lying there, broken, but alive. Jacob said to be careful, and Daniel said he would, and Jacob said to make them pay, and Daniel said he would do that too. And then he and Nantan moved out into the darkness, heading toward the garrison, where 400 Apache warriors were about to teach the Krelvin a lesson they would never forget. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were bright overhead, and Daniel could see his breath in the air, and somewhere in the distance he heard a nightbird calling, and everything seemed very sharp and clear, like the world had come into focus after being blurry for a long time. They reached the ridge overlooking the garrison, and Daniel crouched down beside Lozen, who was watching the compound through electronic binoculars, and she handed them to Daniel without speaking, and he looked through them and saw the Krelvin moving around inside their prefabricated buildings, looking bored and confident. Lozen said they had 30 soldiers in the garrison and standard defensive sensors and automated weapons on the perimeter, but nothing they could not handle, and she said the Krelvin felt safe here because they thought Earth was weak and helpless, and that was going to be their last mistake. Daniel handed back the binoculars and drew his knife and checked the edge, and it was sharp enough to cut light, and beside him Nantan did the same, and all around them in the darkness, 400 warriors made their final preparations and waited for the signal to strike. The attack began so quietly that the Krelvin did not know anything was wrong until it was far too late, and the first sign of trouble was when their perimeter sensors went offline, but the technician on duty thought it was just a malfunction because The equipment was old and had been giving them problems, and he logged the error and went back to his game. He died 30 seconds later when an Apache warrior came through the window behind him and cut his throat before he could make a sound, and the warrior caught the body and lowered it to the floor and then moved on to the next target. Around the garrison perimeter, 20 warriors moved in perfect silence, and they killed the automated gun systems with cutting tools that sliced through metal like it was paper, and they disabled the backup alarms and communication relays, and within 2 minutes, the garrison was blind and deaf and did not know it yet. Lozin led her team to the main entrance, and they placed small charges on the reinforced door, and when they triggered them, the door came apart with barely a sound, and the team poured through like smoke, and the Krelvin inside barely had time to register what was happening before Apache warriors were among them. The first Krelvin to die was reaching for his weapon, when a blade took him in the throat just above his chest armor, and he went down without a sound, and the warrior moved past him already targeting the next enemy, and it all happened so fast that the other Krelvin in the room did not understand what they were seeing. Then the alarms finally started blaring and the garrison came alive with movement, and Krelvin soldiers grabbed their weapons and formed defensive positions, and they thought they were facing some kind of local resistance, and they expected frightened farmers with old rifles, and they expected to crush this attack quickly. What they got was something they had never faced before, and Apache warriors came at them from every direction, and they used the garrison's own layout against them. And they moved through the compound like they had studied it for weeks, and every corner became a killing zone and every defensive position became a trap. The Krelvin were tough and their armor was strong, but the Apache had spent 300 years learning how to kill them, and they knew exactly where to strike, and their blades were made from materials that could cut through Krelvin armor like it was cloth, and their guns fired rounds that were designed to penetrate and fragment. A group of 5 Krelvin formed a defensive line in one of the corridors, and they thought they had created a choke point, and they opened fire with their plasma weapons, and the air filled with superheated bolts. But the Apache did not charge into the kill zone, and instead 3 warriors came through the ceiling and dropped behind the Krelvin line and killed them all in seconds. The Krelvin commander was the same one who had beaten Jacob, and his name was something humans could not pronounce. But he was experienced, and he had fought in a dozen wars, and he realized within the first minute that this was not a rabble of locals, and these were trained soldiers executing a professional assault. He tried to activate the emergency beacon that would call for reinforcements from the nearest Krelvin fleet, but when he pressed the button, nothing happened, and he looked at his communication console and saw it was dead, and he understood then that whoever was attacking had cut them off completely. Outside the garrison, Nantan's team was making sure nothing got out, and they had set up firing positions around the perimeter, and when 3 Krelvin tried to escape through a back door, they were cut down before they made it 10 steps, and their bodies fell in the dust and did not move again. Daniel moved through the garrison with his team, and they encountered Krelvin soldiers in 1s and 2s in small groups, and each time the fight was brief and brutal, and Daniel's training took over, and he stopped thinking and just acted, and his body knew what to do, because Nantan had drilled it into him over 3 years. They found a group of Krelvin barricaded in the armory, and Lozin called up a team with breaching charges, and they blew the door and threw in flash grenades, and the Apache poured in behind them, and the fight inside lasted maybe 20 seconds, and when it was over, all the Krelvin were dead and not one Apache had been scratched. The commander tried to rally his remaining soldiers in the command center, and he had maybe 8 warriors left, and they formed a circle with weapons pointing outward, and the commander was shouting orders and trying to organize a defense, but his soldiers were scared now because they had never faced an enemy like this. Daniel's team reached the command center, and they stacked up outside the door, and Lozin counted down with her fingers, and when she reached 0, they breached, and what happened next was less a battle than an execution, and the Krelvin fought hard. But they were slow compared to Apache warriors, and their armor that had seemed so strong was no protection at all. When the shooting stopped, there was only one Krelvin left standing, and it was the commander, and he had dropped his weapon, and his armor was cracked and leaking, and he was breathing hard, and his eyes were moving from warrior to warrior, looking for any chance to escape, but there was none. Daniel stepped forward and looked at this creature who had beaten his father and destroyed his home, and for a moment he wanted to kill it right there. But Nantan had taught him better, and sometimes killing was too easy, and there were better ways to make a point. Lozin's voice came through the comm system, and she reported that all hostiles were neutralized, and they had 0 casualties, and the garrison was secure, and she was awaiting further orders, and Daniel kept his eyes on the Krelvin commander, and told her to send teams to secure all data and make sure nothing was destroyed. The commander was still trying to understand what had happened, and he looked at the Apache warriors surrounding him. And then his eyes focused on Daniel, and he saw the red sash and the marks of an Apache warrior, and something like understanding came into his face. The commander said in his grinding voice that Daniel had brought the Apache alliance here, and he made it sound like an accusation, and Daniel said yes, he had brought 400 Apache warriors, and the commander asked why, and Daniel said because the Krelvin had hurt his father. The commander seemed confused, and he said it was just one old human, and Daniel felt anger spike in his chest, but he kept his voice level and said that old human was his father, and the commander still did not seem to understand why that mattered, and Daniel realized that the Krelvin simply did not think the way humans or Apache did. Daniel told the commander that he was going to record a message, and the commander was going to explain what the Krelvin had done, and how they had violated Earth's sovereignty, and how the Apache had come to answer that violation. And the commander started to refuse, but Daniel put his weapon against the creature's throat and asked if he wanted to choose the hard way. The commander looked into Daniel's eyes, and whatever he saw there made his decision easy, and he nodded and agreed to record the message, and warriors set up recording equipment, and the commander began to speak, and he told the truth because he knew lying would just make things worse. When the recording was done, Daniel told them to broadcast it to the Krelvin fleet, and to the Galactic Council, and to every news service in the sector, and he wanted everyone to know what had happened here and why, and he wanted them to understand that Earth was not helpless and not alone. Then Daniel made his own recording, and he stood in front of the camera with Apache warriors behind him, and he spoke clearly and directly, and he told the galaxy that humanity was done being pushed around, and they had friends now and allies, and anyone who thought Earth was an easy target needed to reconsider. The sun was starting to rise when they finished, and the garrison was secured, and the Krelvin commander was in restraints, and teams were processing data and preparing evidence, and Daniel walked outside and looked toward where his father's ranch lay in the distance. Nantan came and stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, and finally Nantan said it was a good fight, and Daniel nodded and said it was, and Nantan said Daniel's father would be proud, and Daniel hoped that was true, and he turned and headed back toward the ranch to check on Jacob. Daniel found his father still lying where they had left him, but now there was an Apache medic working on him, and the medic had equipment that was far more advanced than anything the woman from town had been able to provide, and Jacob was unconscious, but his breathing was steadier, and the medic looked up when Daniel approached and said Jacob would live, but he needed proper medical care soon. They loaded Jacob onto a medical transport, and Daniel rode with him and watched his father's face and tried to see past the bruises and swelling to the man he remembered, and it was hard because the Krelvin had hurt him so badly, and Daniel felt the anger trying to come back, but he pushed it down because Nantan was right, and anger was only useful if you controlled it. The transport took them to the nearest human hospital, which was 2 hours away, and the doctors there were shocked when they saw Jacob, and even more shocked when they saw the Apache warriors who came with him, and one doctor tried to say they could not allow aliens in the hospital, but Lozen just looked at him until he stopped talking and moved aside. Jacob was taken into surgery, and Daniel sat in the waiting room with Nantan and Lozen, and a dozen other warriors and people in the hospital kept staring at them, and some looked afraid, and some looked curious, and some looked grateful, because word was spreading fast about what had happened at the garrison. The surgery took 4 hours, and when the doctor came out, he looked tired but satisfied, and he said Jacob would recover, but it would take time, and his arm would need extensive therapy, and his ribs would heal, but might hurt for the rest of his life, and Daniel just nodded and asked when he could see his father. They let Daniel in after another hour, and Jacob was awake but groggy from the medication, and when he saw Daniel he tried to smile, but it hurt too much, and instead he just reached out with his good hand, and Daniel took it and held it, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Finally Jacob asked if it was over, and Daniel said yes, it was over, and Jacob asked about the Krelvin, and Daniel said they were gone, and they would not be coming back, and Jacob nodded slowly and closed his eyes, and Daniel thought he had fallen asleep, but then Jacob spoke again. Jacob said he had heard the garrison was destroyed, and Daniel said yes it was, and Jacob asked how many casualties the Apache had taken, and Daniel said none, and Jacob's eyes opened, and he looked at Daniel like he was not sure he had heard right. And Daniel said again that they had taken 0 casualties. Jacob was quiet for a moment, and then he said 400 warriors against 30 Krelvan soldiers in a fortified position and 0 casualties. And Daniel nodded, and Jacob made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not hurt so much, and he said the Krelvan had made a very big mistake. Over the next few days, the recordings that Daniel had made spread across the galactic network, and they were viewed billions of times, and every species in the galaxy saw the Krelvan commander confessing to illegal occupation, and they saw Daniel standing with Apache warriors explaining what had happened and why. The Galactic Council opened an investigation into Krelvan expansion practices, and they found hundreds of cases where the Krelvan had used galactic salvage law to steal land from species that could not defend themselves, and the Council was embarrassed because they had been allowing this to happen for decades. 3 other species reached out to Earth asking about defense pacts, and they said they had heard what happened, and they wanted to discuss mutual protection agreements, and Earth's government was surprised but pleased, and they started negotiations immediately. The Apache Alliance made a formal announcement that Earth was now under their protection, and any attack on Earth would be considered an attack on Apache territory, and they would respond accordingly, and this was something they had never done before, because the Apache did not usually get involved in other species conflicts, but Daniel was one of them, and they took care of their own. And the message was clear to everyone in the galaxy, and several smaller species started reaching out to the Apache, asking if they could join a mutual defense network, and the old power. Structures that had dominated the galaxy for centuries started to look less stable. The Krelvan Dominion filed protests with the Galactic Council, and they claimed the attack on their garrison was illegal, and that Earth and the Apache had violated their sovereign territory, and they demanded compensation and the return of their soldiers. The Council reviewed the evidence, and the Krelvan's own recordings proved they had no legal claim to the land they had tried to seize, and the Council dismissed all the Krelvan complaints and imposed fines for illegal occupation, and several Council members made speeches about how this kind of predatory expansion would no longer be tolerated. Daniel stayed with his father for 2 weeks while Jacob recovered, and during that time Apache warriors helped rebuild the ranch, and they brought in materials and equipment, and they worked alongside humans from town who volunteered to help, and the house that went up was stronger than the one that had been destroyed. Jacob watched from his bed as his home was rebuilt, and he saw Apache and humans working together. And he saw how the Apache treated everyone with respect, and how they shared their food and their stories, and how the children from town were fascinated by these alien warriors who had come to help. One evening, Nantan sat with Jacob on the porch that had just been finished, and they watched the sunset over the desert, and Nantan asked if Jacob was angry about what had happened, and Jacob thought about it and said yes, he was angry, but he was also grateful because Daniel had come back and brought friends. Nantan said Daniel was a good warrior, and Jacob had raised him well, and Jacob laughed and said he had not raised Daniel to be a warrior, but Nantan shook his head and said, being a warrior was not about fighting, but about knowing what was worth fighting for, and Jacob had taught Daniel that. They sat in silence for a while, and then Jacob asked why the Apache had come, and Nantan said because Daniel was their brother, and brothers help each other, and Jacob said, but Daniel was human, and Nantan looked at him and said, brotherhood was not about species, it was about choices, and Daniel had chosen to be Apache, and they had chosen to accept him. Jacob understood then that his son had found something out among the stars that Earth could not give him, and he had found a people who shared his values and his way of seeing the world, and Jacob was proud of that, even though it meant Daniel would probably never come home permanently. Daniel came out onto the porch carrying 3 cups of coffee, and he handed one to Jacob and one to Nantan, and they sat together watching the stars come out, and somewhere up there among those stars the galaxy was changing, and Earth was no longer alone, and isolated and vulnerable. News reports were calling it the New Mexico incident, and they were saying it marked a turning point in human history, and politicians were giving speeches about Earth's place in the galactic community, and military leaders were studying the Apache attack tactics and trying to understand how they had been so effective. But for Daniel it was simpler than all that, and his father had been hurt and he had called for help, and his brothers had answered and they had dealt with the problem, and now his father was healing and the ranch was being rebuilt, and that was all that mattered. Lozen came to tell Daniel that the Apache forces would be leaving soon, and they would leave a small garrison behind to make sure the Krelvan did not try anything else. And she asked if Daniel was staying or coming back to the frontier, and Daniel looked at his father. Jacob said Daniel should go and do what he needed to do and the ranch would be fine, and there were people here now who would help if anything happened. And besides, Jacob was tougher than he looked, and it would take more than some Krelvan thugs to keep him down. Daniel knew his father was right, but it was still hard to think about leaving. And Jacob saw this and said home would always be here waiting, and Daniel could come back whenever he wanted. But out there among the stars, people needed warriors who understood what they were fighting for. So Daniel agreed to go back to the frontier with Nantan and the others, and they would form a mixed unit of Apache and human soldiers, and they would patrol the outer systems and make sure smaller species were protected from predators like the Krelvan. The transport ship lifted off from Earth 3 weeks after the attack on the garrison, and Daniel stood at the window watching his home planet grow smaller, and he could see the lights of cities and the dark patches of oceans, and somewhere down there his father was standing on a rebuilt porch watching the stars, and Daniel knew they were both thinking about each other. Beside him, Nantan was checking equipment manifests and making sure the new mixed unit had everything it needed, and there were 50 human soldiers who had volunteered to join the Apache forces, and 50 Apache warriors who would train them, and they would operate as a single unit on the frontier. The humans were nervous because most of them had never left Earth before, and they had never worked with aliens, and they were not sure what to expect. But the Apache treated them well and started teaching them immediately, and within a few days the nervousness began to fade. Daniel helped with the training because he understood both human and Apache ways, and he could explain things in ways that made sense to both groups, and he found the teaching was harder than he expected, but also more rewarding, and he started to see how the two groups could work together. One of the human soldiers was a woman named Kate, who had been in Earth's Defense Forces for 5 years, and she was tough and smart, and she learned fast, and she asked Daniel why he had chosen to join the Apache instead of staying with human forces. Daniel thought about it and said, the Apache understood something that most humans did not, and that was how to survive as a smaller species in a galaxy full of bigger and stronger species. And they did not try to match the big species in strength, but instead, they used speed and intelligence and unity. Kate nodded and said that made sense, and she asked if the Apache had always been this way, and Daniel explained about how they had been enslaved by the Krelvan, and how they had fought a war for their freedom, and how that war had taught them that they could never let themselves be weak again. The journey to the frontier took a week, and during that time the mixed unit trained together and learned each other's languages and customs, and by the end of the week, they were starting to feel like a real unit instead of two separate groups. When they arrived at the frontier outpost on Kepler, the commander there was surprised to see humans and Apache working together, and he was even more surprised when he heard about what had happened on Earth, and he said the whole galaxy was talking about it. The commander was an older Apache warrior named Victorio, who had fought in the Liberation War 50 years ago, and he had scars covering half his face, and he walked with a limp, but his eyes were sharp, and he missed nothing, and he looked at the mixed unit and seemed pleased. Victorio called Daniel into his office and asked him to explain everything that had happened, and Daniel told the story from beginning to end, and when he was done, Victorio was quiet for a long time, and then he said Daniel had done well, and his father should be proud. Then Victorio said the galaxy was changing, and what had happened on Earth was just the beginning, and smaller species were starting to realize they did not have to accept being pushed around by the Krelvan and other predator species, and they were looking for allies and protection. Victorio said there were already 5 species asking to join a mutual defense network with Earth and the Apache, and more were expected, and this was something new and potentially very important, and it needed people who understood both military operations and diplomacy. Daniel said he was just a soldier and he was not trained for diplomacy, but Victorio smiled and said diplomacy was just another word for making alliances, and Daniel had already proven he was good at that by bringing together Apache and humans. Over the next few months, the mixed unit conducted patrols along the frontier, and they encountered several situations where smaller species were being pressured by larger ones, and in each case they intervened and made it clear that the days of easy predation were over. One mission took them to a mining colony where a Krelvan corporation was trying to force the local population to accept unfair contracts, and when the mixed unit arrived, the Krelvan backed down immediately because they had heard what happened on Earth and they did not want to test whether the Apache would respond the same way again. Another mission involved escorting a trade convoy through territory claimed by pirates, and the pirates attacked once and were driven off with heavy losses, and after that word spread that convoys protected by the Apache human unit were not worth attacking. Kate proved to be an excellent soldier, and she rose quickly through the ranks, and after 6 months, she was leading her own squad and training new recruits, and Daniel was proud of her progress, and he knew she would go far. The mixed unit earned a reputation for effectiveness and fairness, and species started requesting their presence specifically when they had problems. And Victorio said this was exactly what he had hoped would happen, and the unit was becoming a model for how different species could work together. Back on Earth, things were changing too, and Jacob sent regular messages telling Daniel about how the Apache garrison had become part of the community, and how humans and Apache were learning from each other, and how the children from town loved visiting the garrison to hear stories. Jacob's injuries healed slowly, but he recovered enough to work the ranch again, and he said the Apache had taught him new irrigation techniques that were helping his crops grow better in the desert, and he was planning to expand his operation. The Galactic Council formally revised galactic salvage law to require species to demonstrate they had attempted peaceful negotiation before claiming territory, and they had to prove the target world truly had no defensive capabilities, including defense pacts and alliances. This change made it much harder for predator species to justify their expansions, and several ongoing occupation attempts were reversed, and the smaller species celebrated this as a major victory. The Krelvan Dominion was furious about these changes, and they made threats about leaving the Galactic Council, but everyone knew they would not actually leave, because they benefited too much from council membership and trade agreements. Daniel received a message from Chief Cochise, congratulating him on the mixed unit's success, and saying the Apache Alliance was proud of what he had accomplished, and they were creating 3 more mixed units with other species who had requested similar arrangements. Cochise said Daniel would be promoted and given command of the original mixed unit permanently, and he would report directly to Victorio, and his mission would be to continue patrolling the frontier and protecting smaller species from predation. Daniel accepted the promotion, and he felt honored but also aware of the responsibility, and he knew that everything the mixed unit did would be watched by the entire galaxy, and they needed to maintain their reputation for effectiveness and fairness. One evening, Daniel sat with Nantan on the observation deck of the outpost, and they watched the stars, and Nantan said he was proud of Daniel and proud of how far he had come since that day in the alley, when Nantan had found him bleeding and angry. Daniel said he could not have done any of it without Nantan's teaching, and Nantan said teaching was easy when the student was willing to learn, and Daniel had always been willing to learn, even when the lessons were hard. They talked about the future and what it might hold, and Nantan said he thought the galaxy was entering a new era, and the old power structures were breaking down, and smaller species were finding their voices and their strength. Daniel said he hoped Nantan was right, and Nantan said hope was good, but preparation was better, and they needed to make sure the mixed unit was ready for whatever challenges came next. A message came through from Earth, and it was from Jacob, and he said the ranch was doing well and he had hired some help because the operation was getting too big for one person. And he asked when Daniel might be able to visit. Daniel checked the schedule and saw they had a 3-week leave period coming up in 2 months, and he sent a message back saying he would come home then, and Jacob replied immediately saying he would have a room ready. Daniel looked forward to seeing his father and the ranch and walking the land that his family had worked for generations, and he wanted to see how the Apache garrison had integrated into the community, and he wanted to thank the people who had helped his father when he was injured. But he also knew that home was different now, and he was different, and the galaxy was different, and nothing would ever be quite the same as it was before the Krelvan came, and sometimes he missed the simpler days, but mostly he was glad for how things had turned out. The message came through on a routine patrol 6 months after the incident on Earth, and it was marked Priority 1, which meant something serious was happening, and Daniel read it quickly and felt his stomach tighten because the situation was exactly what they had been worried about. A species called the Tellan were being pressured by a Krelvan mining operation on their homeworld, and the Krelvan were demanding access to mineral deposits under Tellan cities, and they were threatening to take the deposits by force if the Tellan did not agree. The Tellan had reached out to the Galactic Council, but the Council was moving slowly as it always did, and the Krelvin were not waiting, and they had moved warships into orbit and were making aggressive moves, and the Talon were afraid their world would be invaded. Victorio called an emergency meeting and Daniel attended along with Lozin and the other senior commanders, and Victorio explained the situation and said they needed to decide how to respond. Lozin said they should deploy immediately and make it clear to the Krelvin that the Talon were under protection, but another commander named Geronimo argued they should wait for council authorization because acting without it could cause political problems. Daniel listened to the debate and understood both sides, but he thought about his father and about how the council had not helped Earth and about how the only thing that had stopped the Krelvin was direct action. When Victorio asked for Daniel's opinion, he said they should deploy, but they should also inform the council of their actions and make it clear they were operating under the mutual defense agreements that the council itself had validated. Victorio considered this and then nodded and said Daniel's approach made sense, and they would deploy 3 units, including the mixed unit, and they would position themselves between the Krelvin fleet and the Talon homeworld. The deployment happened fast, and within 8 hours, 3 Apache ships carrying the mixed unit and 2 other Apache units were in transit, and they arrived in the Talon system 2 days later. The Krelvin fleet consisted of 5 warships, and they were older models but still dangerous, and they were in a blockade formation around the Talon homeworld. And when the Apache ships arrived, the Krelvin commander sent an angry message demanding they leave immediately. Victorio was commanding the Apache force, and he replied calmly that the Talon were under mutual defense protection, and the Apache were there to ensure their sovereignty was respected, and the Krelvin needed to withdraw their blockade and negotiate peacefully. The Krelvin commander said the Apache had no authority here, and this was a matter between the Krelvin Dominion and the Talon, and the Apache needed to mind their own business or face the consequences. Victorio's response was simple and direct, and he said the Apache were making this their business, and the Krelvin had 3 options, and they could withdraw peacefully, or they could negotiate fairly, or they could test whether Apache ships were as effective as Apache ground forces. There was a long silence after that, and Daniel watched the tactical display and saw the Krelvin ships holding position, and he knew the Krelvin commander was talking to his superiors and trying to decide what to do. Kate was standing beside Daniel, and she asked quietly if he thought the Krelvin would actually fight, and Daniel said he did not know, but the Krelvin respected strength, and they had been embarrassed by what happened on Earth, and they might decide to make a stand here. The tension stretched for hours, and the Apache ships maintained their position between the Krelvin fleet and the planet, and on board the ship's warriors prepared for the possibility of combat and checked their equipment and made peace with whatever might happen. Then the Krelvin commander sent another message, and he said the Apache were making a mistake, and the Krelvin Dominion would not tolerate this interference, and if the Apache did not withdraw within 1 hour, the Krelvin would open fire. Victorio consulted with his commanders, and Lozin said they should call for reinforcements, but Victorio said there was no time, and they needed to make a decision now, and he asked each commander for their vote. Every commander voted to hold position, and Daniel's vote was among them, and Victorio nodded and sent a message back to the Krelvin saying the Apache would not withdraw, and if the Krelvin opened fire, they would defend themselves. The hour passed, slowly, and Daniel stood on the bridge of his ship watching the clock count down, and beside him, Nantan was calm as always, and he said whatever happened, they had done the right thing. When the hour ended, nothing happened for a few minutes, and then the Krelvin ships began moving, and for a moment Daniel thought they were going to attack, but then he realized they were turning away and moving out of orbit. The Krelvin fleet withdrew from the system, and the Krelvin commander sent one final message saying this was not over, and the Dominion would remember what happened here, and there would be consequences. Victorio replied that the Apache would be ready whenever the Krelvin wanted to continue the discussion, and then he ordered his ships to maintain position until the Galactic Council could send observers to ensure the Krelvin did not return. The Talon government sent messages of gratitude, and they asked to meet with the Apache commanders, and Victorio agreed, and they went down to the planet's surface where they were greeted as heroes. The Talon were a small species with gray fur and large eyes, and they were peaceful by nature and had no real military capability, and they said they had been terrified of what the Krelvin would do. Daniel met with Talon leaders and they asked him about Earth and about how humans had formed an alliance with the Apache, and Daniel told them the story, and they listened with great interest. One Talon leader asked if other species could join this mutual defense network, and Daniel said that was not his decision, but he thought the Apache would be open to discussing it, and the leader said they would send a formal request immediately. Over the next week, more species reached out asking about joining the defense network, and it became clear that what had happened in the Talon system was another turning point, and smaller species were realizing they did not have to face predator species alone. The Galactic Council sent observers as promised, and they also sent a delegation to meet with Victorio, and they expressed concern about the Apache taking military action without Council authorization. Victorio listened politely, and then explained that the Apache had acted under mutual defense agreements that were legal under Council law, and they had not fired first, and had only positioned themselves to protect their allies. The Council delegation was not happy, but they could not argue with Victorio's logic, and they eventually agreed that the Apache actions were technically legal, and they withdrew their objections. But the lead Council delegate warned Victorio that the Council was concerned about the growing power of this new defense network, and they did not want to see the galaxy split into competing alliances. Victorio said the Council had nothing to worry about as long as they did their job and protected smaller species from predation, but if the Council failed to do that, then species would protect themselves. The delegation left looking unhappy, and Daniel asked Victorio if he thought the Council would become a problem, and Victorio said possibly. But the Council's real concern was not about law or order, but about power and control. Victorio explained that for centuries the major species had controlled the Council and used it to maintain their dominance, and now smaller species were finding ways to resist that dominance, and the major species did not like it. Daniel understood then that what they were doing was about more than just stopping the Krelvan or protecting individual species, and it was about changing the fundamental power structure of the galaxy. The mixed unit returned to the frontier outpost and they were greeted with celebration because word of what had happened in the Talon system had spread, and everyone knew the Apache had faced down a Krelvan fleet without firing a shot. Kate said it was the proudest moment of her military career, and several other human soldiers agreed. And they said they had joined the mixed unit hoping to make a difference, and now they felt they really were. Daniel received another message from his father, and Jacob said he had heard about the standoff with the Krelvan fleet, and he was proud but also worried, and he asked Daniel to be careful. Daniel wrote back promising to be as careful as possible, but also explaining that sometimes you had to take risks for things that mattered, and protecting species from predators like the Krelvan was one of those things. Jacob replied saying he understood, and he had not raised his son to run from hard choices, and he just wanted Daniel to know that home was always waiting whenever Daniel needed it. That night, Daniel stood on the observation deck looking at the stars and thinking about everything that had happened since the Krelvan attacked his father, and how one act of violence had started a chain of events that was changing the galaxy. The transport touched down on Earth 6 months after the standoff in the Talon system, and Daniel stepped off onto New Mexico's soil and breathed air that tasted like home, and he felt something in his chest relax that he had not realized was tight. His father was waiting at the landing pad, and Jacob looked better than he had in the hospital, and his arm had healed, and he was moving without the careful stiffness that pain causes. And when he saw Daniel, he smiled wide and genuine. They embraced, and Jacob held his son tight, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there were no words for what they felt. And finally Jacob stepped back and looked at Daniel and said, he looked older, and Daniel said he felt older. The ranch was thriving, and as they drove toward it, Daniel could see new irrigation systems and expanded fields and new buildings that had not been there before, and Jacob explained that the Apache techniques had increased his yields by 40%. The house looked the same but better and stronger, and there were solar panels on the roof that the Apache had installed, and a new workshop behind the main building where Jacob was experimenting with hybrid crops that combined earth and alien agricultural methods. Inside the house, everything was familiar and comfortable, and there were pictures on the walls showing 3 generations of Morgans who had worked this land, and now there were new pictures too, showing Daniel with his Apache brothers and sisters. They sat on the porch as the sun set and drank coffee, and Jacob asked about the Tellin situation, and Daniel told him everything. And Jacob listened carefully, and when Daniel was done, Jacob said it sounded like Daniel had found his calling. Daniel said he had never expected his life to turn out this way, and Jacob laughed and said, "Nobody ever expects how their life will turn out, and the best you can do is make good choices when hard decisions come," and Daniel seemed to be doing that. Over the next few days, Daniel visited the Apache garrison and met with the warriors stationed there, and they treated him with respect and pride because his reputation had spread and everyone knew about the mixed unit and what they had accomplished. The garrison commander was a warrior named Chato, who had served in the Liberation War, and he told Daniel that what was happening now reminded him of those days when the Apache were fighting for their freedom and building alliances with other oppressed species. Chato said the difference was that this time the movement was bigger and involved more species and had a real chance of changing the galaxy permanently, and he was honored to be part of it even in a small way. Daniel visited the town and was surprised by how much had changed, and there were Apache living and working alongside humans, and there was a cultural center where both species taught each other their histories and traditions, and children of both species played together. Kate had come with Daniel because she wanted to see Earth and meet his father, and Jacob liked her immediately and said she reminded him of Daniel's mother, who had been tough and smart and not afraid of anything. Kate and Jacob talked for hours about farming and military tactics and life on the frontier, and Daniel listened and smiled because it was good to see his father connecting with someone from his new life. On the third day, a message came through from Victorio, and it was marked urgent, and Daniel read it quickly and felt the familiar tightness return to his chest because another situation was developing, and the mixed unit was needed. The message said that 12 species had formally requested to join the Mutual Defense Network, and the Apache Alliance was organizing a summit to discuss how to structure this new organization, and they needed Daniel there to represent the human perspective. Jacob saw Daniel's face and knew what it meant, and he said duty was calling, and Daniel nodded and said he was sorry to cut his visit short, but Jacob waved that away and said there was nothing to apologize for. Jacob said he was proud of what Daniel was doing and proud of the person Daniel had become. And if that meant Daniel could not stay on Earth for long, then that was fine, because the work Daniel was doing mattered more than one old rancher's desire for company. Daniel said Jacob was not just one old rancher, and he was the reason Daniel knew how to stand up for what was right. And Jacob smiled and said, then he had done his job as a father, and everything else was just details. They spent one more evening together on the porch, and Jacob asked if Daniel was happy, and Daniel thought about it and said he was not sure happy was the right word, but he felt like he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, and that was more important than happy. Jacob nodded and said that was wisdom, and most people never figured that out, and they spent their whole lives chasing happiness instead of purpose, and Daniel had found his purpose young, which was a gift. The transport came the next morning, and Daniel said goodbye to his father and promised to visit again soon, and Jacob said the door was always open and the coffee was always hot, and Daniel should come home whenever he could. Kate stood beside Daniel as the transport lifted off, and they watched the ranch grow smaller below them, and Kate said she understood now why Daniel fought so hard, and Daniel asked what she meant, and Kate said his father had taught him what was worth protecting. The summit was held on Zil-Nanchasi on the Apache homeworld, and representatives from 14 species attended, including humans and Tellin and several others who had been helped by the Apache forces. Chief Cochise opened the summit by explaining that the galaxy was at a crossroads, and smaller species could either continue to be victims of larger predator species, or they could band together and protect each other. The debate lasted 3 days, and there were disagreements about structure and command and responsibilities, but everyone agreed on the basic principle that they were stronger together than apart. In the end, they created something called the Frontier Alliance, and it was a mutual defense pact that committed each species to defend the others and to share military resources and intelligence and training. The Apache Alliance would provide military leadership initially, but over time, other species would develop their own forces, and the goal was for every member species to be able to defend themselves and help defend others. Daniel was appointed as one of the Alliance military coordinators along with Lozen and several other senior Apache commanders, and his job was to help train and integrate forces from the different species. The Krelvan Dominion issued formal protests and said the Frontier Alliance was an illegal military organization, and the Galactic Council needed to disband it immediately, but the Council refused because the alliance was not actually illegal under Council law. Several major species expressed concern about the alliance and worried it would lead to increased conflict, but the alliance members made it clear they were defensive, not aggressive, and they only wanted to protect themselves from predation. Over. The following year, the Frontier Alliance grew to include 23 species, and they established joint bases on frontier worlds and conducted combined training exercises and showed the galaxy that smaller species were serious about their defense. The Krelvan tested the Alliance several times with small provocations, but each time the Alliance responded quickly and effectively, and the Krelvan backed down, and gradually they learned that the days of easy expansion were over. Other predator species also tested the Alliance and also learned the same lesson, and slowly the balance of power in the galaxy began to shift. Daniel returned to Earth twice more that year, and each time his father looked older but also more content, and Jacob said he was happy, because he was seeing his son change the galaxy, and that was more than most fathers could say. On his third visit, Jacob told Daniel about a young couple from town who wanted to buy some of his land and start their own ranch, and Jacob was thinking of selling because the operation was getting too big for him to manage even with help. Daniel asked if his father was ready to retire, and Jacob laughed and said, "Retire from what, and he would work this land until the day he died." But that did not mean he had to work all of it. They talked about the future and what it might hold, and Jacob said he thought the Frontier Alliance was just the beginning, and eventually there would be other alliances and networks, and the whole structure of galactic power would change. Daniel said he hoped Jacob was right, and Jacob said hope was good. But the real question was whether Daniel was ready for the responsibility, because people would look to him for leadership and guidance. Daniel said he was not sure he was ready, but Nantan had taught him that nobody was ever really ready, and you just did the best you could and learned from your mistakes. Jacob nodded and said that was good enough, and then he asked if Daniel had thought about what would happen to the ranch when Jacob was gone, and Daniel was quiet for a moment. Daniel said he had thought about it, and he knew he could not run the ranch himself because his life was in space now, but he wanted the land to stay in the family somehow. Jacob said he had been thinking the same thing, and maybe one of Daniel's children would want to run the ranch someday. And Daniel said he did not have any children, and Jacob smiled and said, "Not yet, but there was time." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out, and somewhere up there the Frontier Alliance was growing stronger, and the galaxy was changing, and the old order that had dominated for centuries was beginning to crack. Daniel thought about everything that had happened since the Krelvan attacked,